capital city of Pandora lies in a valley nestled into the side of a mountain range. As the sun sets, the sky darkens overhead, but more than it should. It becomes pitch black and a dark fog descends into the city. Pandora is under attack. Oberon's forces have now started the beginning of the end. Mutated dark orcs and ogres rush the main gates. Hooded necromancers start to emerge from the pockets of fog, and an undead army floods over the mountain range behind the city. What do? Twitch the Chronomancer speeds himself up and flies around the city, telling people to retreat to his mage tower for safety. Dalar, the elemental archer, shapeshifts into a lightning elemental, flies up to the top of the city to see what's going on. Upon learning how bad it is, Bardon, the Barbarian, uses his sentient magic item that he's unlocked massive teleportation abilities from and bamps around the city, trying to gather up the party's loved ones in this chaos. With the people now running to the mage tower, the Chrono Wizard uses his altered time speed to fly around the city, counterspelling all the necromancers, giving the guards a fighting chance. But then, the elemental archer tries to take on the horde of enemies at the gate by himself. It fails. The gates of the city have fallen. The Barbarian, still scrambling to save his pregnant wife and other key NPCs that the party's grown to love over the years. But now the Elemental Archer retreats back to the high ground and shifts back into his elven form. He goes full Legolas mode with his charged arrows and starts taking out huge chunks of the mutated orcs. The Chronomancer digs deep. The city might fall. He uses his extreme tactics and intellect to create strategically placed force walls that funnel the undead horde into one single location and starts to slow them in place. And it's only now that the Barbarian finishes saving the loved ones and goes to join his brothers. The Elemental Archer sees this slowed undead horde and uses one of his new abilities. He shapeshifts into a radiant elemental and with a flood of divine energy sweeps through the undead horde. But then, the Chronomancer, seeing all the dead and injured around him, he tries to heal them by rewinding those wounds and injuries. But it's just not enough. With the gates already fallen, the ogres ransack through the districts. But it's at that very moment that a bright bolt of lightning strikes down from the skies. And with a rage-filled scream, the Storm Herald Barbarian enters the fray. Now it's his turn. With all the loved ones safe and the city on the brink, he goes straight Thor mode. He teleports high into the sky, weapon held high, crackling with energy, and comes down like a human thunderbolt, decimating the horde, hacking and slashing through the enemies as his allies join him. The last of the army has fallen. The fog retracts, fading away from the city. The party stands victorious, alongside the city and its people. The battle is won, but now the war has begun. This was a level 19 skill challenge that I threw at my players near the end of our 3-year-long campaign. It was actually this fight that got them to level 20 and got them ready to go take on Oberon himself. The big bad of the campaign, and during all of this that I just explained, there was a fourth player at the table. Raylor the Paladin was in the middle of his own skill challenge, trying to save his home city from a similar attack. He single-handedly fended off those attacks and saved his people. So how would you run a citywide massive battle without it being a slog? If I ran this as a combat, not only would it take forever, but how would I block it off with the minis? Or have a battle map the size of a city? I wanted to give my 19th level players the feeling of hacking down hordes of enemies without having to make hundreds of dice rolls, rolling for each individual attack and skill check along the way. Traveling around a city with round-to-round movement, 6 seconds at a time? No. So what is this skill challenge and how do you do it? This actually comes from Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition, and along with the minions mechanic are the two best things that come from it. These are fast-paced action cutscenes for these big moments of action, but you can use these for just about anything. Some generic examples: running towards something like a chase scene or a stagecoach getaway, running away from something like a prison break or an escape, or trying to defend the city in my example. This system gives mechanics to D&D 5th edition that I feel are just not there, and it fills a pretty big gap. So here's the idea. Skill challenges can be used in any situation where your PCs have some objective they want to accomplish, or else something bad will happen if they fail, which happens all the time in D&D. So in my example, it's saving a city under siege, or else people die and the entire city falls. This whole thing works on a simple system of successes and failures. You need a certain amount of successes before 3 failures. Whichever one fills up first is the result of the challenge. We'll talk about what happens when players fail in a second, but how do you know how hard to make this thing? The difficulty of a skill challenge depends on 2 things. How many successes you need before those 3 failures, because it's always 3 failures, and the DC that you set for what you need to roll for each success. The easiest skill challenge I've ever done was 3 successes before 3 failures, and the DC was 12. And the most difficult skill challenge was that example I just gave, where they needed 8 successes before 3 failures and the DC was 20. A skill challenge is a group-based challenge where every player collectively contributes to the successes and failures. So how do you run it? Now I have tweaked these mechanics from the rules as written to get it to a spot that feels really good for me. So the best way to learn this is for me to walk you through with an example. I'll explain how it works for the DM and the players along the way. Make sure you watch this whole example because I sprinkle rules out along the way. This is another real example of a skill challenge I threw at my players. Back at like level 7 or 8 or something. The party's traveling through a deep rocky canyon. 30 to 40 feet high walls on each side. They feel the ground start to shake beneath them. They look back and see the canyon collapsing in on itself as this avalanche of rocks quickly approaches to bury them alive. Skill challenge. As the DM, you need to decide beforehand or on the fly how difficult this will be. For this skill challenge, it was 5 successes before 3 failures, and the DC was 15 for a success. You can either tell the players that DC or let them figure it out on their own as they get successes. But once it starts, tell your players that they've now entered a skill challenge. The first one of these you throw at your players, you're gonna have to explain how it works and maybe even help them. There's a lot of creativity required for this. But after they've experienced their first one, they'll know what to do. Players go around the table, round by round, saying what they do for this situation. Similar to combat, but there's no initiative roll, so each round order is unique. And once every player's had a turn, that's the end of the round. Now this next part's optional, but sometimes I'll throw something at them at the end of each round. Kind of like a layer action of some kind. This could be some sort of save they have to make from an environmental or a spell effect. Or they might get attacked by whatever enemies are around. This goes on round by round until you max out the successes or max out the failures. Once any player comes up with an idea of what they want to do, they describe what they do to try and get 1 success. But if they don't roll high enough to beat that DC, they get 1 failure instead. This is my favorite part because the players have to get creative and use their characters in ways they might never have before. They need to look at the set of skills they have, what are they good at, and how could they apply that to this situation. They might have a really high plus to their stealth roll, but how would that help in an avalanche situation? But if you can think of a way to use stealth to save yourself from an avalanche, comment down below. I can think of one. But to me, creativity is king in these challenges. So if it's creative enough, I'd say go for it. So that first round, players have to scramble on the spot to come up with something. And once they describe what they're attempting to do, you ask them to make a skill check. Simple as that. So let's get back to the example of what my players did. The avalanche is rapidly approaching. What do you do? So they all take off running. The only person mounted here was the paladin. The first player to speak was the geomancer, sorcerer homebrew. Falling earth, this was his element. Literally. He describes that he wants to take the ground beneath him to attack the falling debris before it hits them. So I asked him to make a spell attack roll for his check.
Excuse me, Dungeon Coach. Last time I checked, that's not an ability check.
I know. I also add flat ability checks, saving throws, attack rolls, and even initiative checks to all of these options. It just feels better. So he gets a 19 with his roll. That's 1 success. The rocks shatter overhead as now only pebbles fall on them. For now. Now the paladin speaks up. He was the only one mounted, so he just wanted to go all in and try and get ahead of this thing. So I asked him to make an initiative check. 15 exactly, 2 successes. As the sorcerer knocks out the rocks, the paladin charges through, advancing ahead. The druid chimes in next and he wants to use his keen eyes to look for pockets of safety from the falling rocks. I ask him to make a perception check. 16, that's 3 successes. Things are going great so far. The druid becomes the shot caller, pointing out danger along the way, and they get over halfway through. The barbarian's last to go, and he describes that he wants to nimbly parkour from rock to rock along the sides of the canyon, looking for the most efficient path possible. And I ask him for an acrobatics check. He rolls low and only gets an 11. That's the first fail. So now that all 4 players have gone, that's the end of the round. Now this is where that optional layer action comes in. And I did choose to use it for this one because I thought it was fitting. I had all my players roll a dexterity saving throw to avoid the falling rocks. I gave the paladin advantage because he was ahead and the barbarian disadvantage because he was behind. Decide how much damage would be appropriate and roll. The DC for this is the same DC as the challenge itself. Everyone in the party succeeds and only takes half damage, except for the sorcerer. He fails and takes full damage and starts to fall behind. Now time out. These saving throw failures don't count for the overall failures of the challenge. Okay, at the end of a round is where I take stock on what's happening and give a description so that all players are on the same page before we go into round 2. All of this is very fast paced and you do want to keep things moving, but you don't want players to get lost about who is where. That really kills the pacing and tension. So for me, it's a real quick, okay, that's 3 successes and 1 failure. The paladin's in the lead, druid just behind him, barbarian and sorcerer are falling behind, because the acrobatics check fail and the dexterity saving throw fail. I want the players to understand this because what they don't know right now is in case of a total group failure, Whoever's falling behind gets trapped under the rubble. Now the players don't know that's what the mechanic is yet, but I want them to be aware that they're in danger. Here's where I'm going to tell you one of the biggest rules. I do not allow duplicate ability checks from round to round. That means once someone has used a certain ability check, that is off the table for next round. So for next round, attack rolls, perception checks, initiative checks, and acrobatics checks are off limits. Someone could do those again in round 3, but the rule is just not back to back. This keeps things spicy and prevents things from getting too repetitive. Because if not, every player should just use their best ability over and over again until they eventually win. This also fosters creativity in all of your players. It gets them to think about things that only they could do to keep the options open for everybody else. The last rule here is what the sorcerer is about to do: aid ally. This is a cool mechanic that really promotes teamwork. Instead of going for a success, a player can instead describe how they're helping one of their allies, granting them advantage on their next check instead. All the same rules still apply here. No duplicate checks, and if they fail, it still counts to the overall total. And the DC to aid an ally is 5 less than whatever the skill challenge is. They only needed 10 now to grant an ally advantage. This is a cool strategy option to boost a future roll and lower a DC of your own, but the risk of failure is still on the table. Players can really team up and set each other up for success, but if they do this too much, more and more rounds will go by, leading to more and more layer actions. Okay, round 2. Paladin's in the lead, the druid's in the middle, and the sorcerer barbarian are in trouble. There's that little recap. The geomancer sees what the barbarian was trying to do, so he attempts to help him by levitating rocks up, forming step-like platforms for him to jump between. So I ask him to make a spell ability check, 14, but since this is an aid ally check, the DC is only 10, that's a success. The barbarian has advantage on his next skill check. The barbarian sees this and goes for it. He describes he wants to jump from rock to rock to try and get up and out of the canyon. I never thought about one of them getting out of the canyon before the skill challenge was over, but it was super creative and the rest of them were still down there, so let's go. I asked him for an athletics checks with advantage because of the sorcerer. He gets a 13 and a 22. So that advantage gave him the 22, success. One more to go. The barbarian leaps from rock to rock, clinging to the edge and pulling himself up as he runs alongside looking for how else he can help his party. And now, the druid gets really creative, and he comes up with a way he can use his high nature roll in this situation. He asks me if he can use his prowess with the earth and nature to look at the falling rocks and see which ones are more stable, being able to better predict a safe path. I was like, whoa, that's a sick nature check. Go ahead. Sadly, he rolled really low and got a 10. Second failure. So I described that he got so caught up looking at rock formations, he starts to fall behind and is now back with the sorcerer. With that second failure, I now described that the end of the canyon's in sight, but the druid and the sorcerer are in trouble. I look to both of them and say, one more failure and you will be crushed underneath the rubble. Time out! This is important. The players always know there's 3 failures, but they don't know what the stakes are. Now sometimes it's obvious, but as they fail, I start to give them hints on what might actually happen. This also ratchets up the tension as everyone starts to understand what might happen. So if it does, the players don't feel surprised or cheated. And then this happened. The Aasimar Paladin, leader of the group, riding out in front, looks up to see the barbarian safe, then looks back over his shoulder at his 2 friends who are about to be crushed. He looks at me and says, I want to ride back and save them, and I will sacrifice my body and life to do so. Damn, I got nerd chills just thinking about it. Now I was shocked, and I had to really think about what kind of role this would be. Comment down below what you would make him do, or what check you would have him made. This whole thing was so epic, and when players do awesome stuff, I want to reward it. There isn't a literal skill check in the game for this, and the player didn't have one in mind when he said what he did. He just knew what his character would do in that moment. And again, because this is so awesome, I wanted to give him a check that he'd have a high roll for. So since he was sacrificing his body, I went with a Constitution saving throw. But before he rolled, I told him, if you do this, you will take a lot of damage if you try and save both of them. And if you fail this roll, the challenge will be over. And you alone will be trapped underneath the rubble and most likely die. He nodded his head and said, as long as they live, it's worth the risk. I say, then make a Constitution saving throw. Everyone stands up and leans forward to see what this thing is. It hits the table. 17. Success! I tell them that's it, 5 successes, and I describe the paladin charging back into danger to save his friends, shield held high overhead, blocking boulder after boulder. He takes only half damage from that 12d6 I threw at him, but he scoops up his allies and gets out of the canyon just in time. Skill challenge complete. And for some behind the scenes, if they had failed, then whatever player was behind would make one final dexterity saving throw for a stupid amount of damage that I calculated beforehand that would most likely kill them, leaving the surviving party members to try and dig them out before they fail 3 death saving throws. I could have also ratcheted this up to if they failed, they immediately go unconscious under the rocks. But make sure you know what happens if they do fail the whole thing, and even what happens on each failure. Each failure could mean the person that failed is now in trouble, like I did in this example. Or in the first example I gave, it was more citywide. One failure meant a breach of the gates and the horde was now in the city. The second failure was a death of large amount of the populace, including key NPCs that the players had loved. And 3 failures was mass casualties across the board, the entire city wiped out, and all of those NPCs dead. And I would have described that the players eventually do hack down all of the forces, but they'd be standing over a city of nothing but rubble. So failure doesn't have to be that they literally failed what they were trying to do. It's more so about what loss they take. The challenge wasn't to see if they could fight out this army. They're super strong, of course they can, but can they do it quick enough? So now that you know how skill challenges work, if you rewatch the first part of this video, you'll understand where those successes and failures were coming from. I would love to hear what checks you think I asked for each of those down in the comments. 2 things I also want you to notice is the Barbarian spent 3 rounds just saving people. This is something the player came up with on the spot and asked if he could do. He would sacrifice his entire turn to save specific NPCs. I made him roll for this, but it was outside of the successes and failures. But after he saved everyone, he was definitely able to come back in and end it with a bang. You also might notice in round 3, the Chronomancer got 2 successes in only 1 round. He rolled a natural 20, which I count as 2 successes. And the opposite is true for natural 1s though. So that's the basics of a skill challenge, and I hope that was a clear and fun way to show you how it works. But there's much, much more that I have on this to be able to take these skill challenges up to the next level and make you more confident in running them. I also have a bunch of variant options if you want to change things up and make it more your own. But I really try and keep all my videos jam-packed under 20 minutes, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it on this one. So as usual, if this video gets 100 likes, I'll make that follow-up video on advanced tips for skill challenges. So here's how videos work on my channel now. I read every comment and video recommendation you guys make, and I put them on a spreadsheet. And then I take that list to my Patreons, and they vote on which video they want to see next. I just started this up last week, and I thought it was crazy that I got 3 patrons already. So a big shout out to Paul Cave, Solar FM, and VArge. I really hope I said that right. I gave them the list of y'all's recommendations, and they picked what they wanted. They chose the video y'all recommended on mundane and low-powered magic items for low-level PCs. And again, thank you so much for supporting me. It really feels crazy. But if you are interested in supporting this channel, I did just make a video on how my Patreon works and the different reward tiers that I have. Time out. I almost forgot. Like I said, everyone has a voice. If all the people on my channel really want to see something and they really make their voices heard with all those likes, I don't want that to get slowed down through a voting process. So if a video I say I'll make hits that certain amount of likes, I will make that as a bonus video entirely separate from the videos I make every Saturday. And my homebrew combat rules video is 2 likes away. We got a new Discord server, new Patreon stuff, and a new giveaway. Lots of stuff happening on this channel. Everything I just talked about is down in the description and in all the videos right here. Peace.